And now let's proceed to our program featuring Congressman Doc Hastings. Doc Hastings first joined the U.S. House of Representatives in 1995 to serve Washington's 4th Congressional District. He brought with him solid legislative experience and a strong work ethic, coupled with the desire to bring the common sense traditional values of Central Washington back to Washington, D.C. Before serving in Congress, Doc served 8 years in the Washington State Legislature. During his time in the House of Representatives, Doc established a long record of serving the people, communities, and priorities of Central Washington. Doc founded the bipartisan Congressional Nuclear Cleanup Caucus to promote the cleanup of nuclear waste sites like Hanford. Since then, he has earned a reputation as an effective leader on nuclear cleanup issues. Each year, Doc works to ensure that Hanford's cleanup progress is accomplished as safely, quickly, and efficiently as possible. At the start of the 112th Congress, Doc was selected by his colleagues to serve as the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee. The committee has a major role in producing more American-made energy with control over hydropower and oil and gas reserves on public lands and waters. Under Doc's leadership, the committee is dedicated to pursuing policies that both strengthen our economy and protect our nation's treasured lands, oceans, and wildlife. Please help me welcome Representative Doc Hastings.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, it's always a pleasure to be here, and this is indeed a very, very good crowd on an August day. What are you all doing here, for goodness sakes? This is the Tri-Cities. It's summertime. Should be enjoying all the things out there. Well, I always, like I say, always appreciate coming back here, and it's always it seems like it's in the month of August, which is the longest break that Washington, D.C. takes. We have the district work period for the entire month of August. As a matter of fact, I think that's been going on since going back to probably the first Congress, or first time they met in Washington, D.C. And if anybody's been in Washington, D.C. in August, you can understand why. You don't want to be in Washington, D.C. in August. So as a result, we have a district work period, then we'll go back into session right after, a week after Labor Day. I want to touch on a couple of, on a national issue, and to me, what I'm going to show you is very sobering from the standpoint of the consequences if we don't deal with what I'm going to show you. And then I want to talk about some local issues, some local projects that I've been working on. And then I'll open it up to questions, and when Lori stands up, I'll know that my time is up, or Toby or whoever is going to be the timekeeper on this. Well, the first thing that I want to talk about is that we have some huge challenges on the federal level. And there's one thing, no matter what our occupations are, one thing that we all have in common is that we are taxpayers. And this is a government of the people, and so you are part of this government. But we have some challenges, particularly in the fiscal area. And I want to put up a slide here and show you where we are. This is the, I have a laser here if I can get it right. Yeah, if you can see that. This is a graph that goes back to 1940 on your far left, all the way to 2080 on your far right. And this first line that has 100 on it is essentially the gross domestic product in the private sector. And what this graph shows, going back to the start of the Second World War, is government spending as it relates to the gross domestic product. Now you can see here during the Second World War, obviously when we suspended essentially the private economy to fight the Second World War, government spending slightly exceeded the gross domestic product. Right after the Second World War, that line came down, and when you look at that line up to 2010 or 29 in that time period, gross federal spending as it relates to gross domestic product was in the 20% level. So in other words, you have about a 50-year window of saying, okay, federal spending was at that level. So I think that's probably a pretty good measurement, considering that's about a quarter of the time that we've been a country. And even during some bad times since the Second World War, that level has remained pretty constant. For example, prior to 2011 or 2001, when we were attacked, in George Bush's term, when he entered office, that ratio was slightly under 20%. We had come off 3 years in a row, by the way, of balancing the budget, and we paid down $500 billion in debt. But even though we got attacked and the economy shuddered after that, and we developed a new agency, Department of Homeland Security, and are fighting 2 wars, when Bush left office, that figure was just slightly under 21% of GDP. So it was pretty constant. But as you can see, it jumps up dramatically from here. In fact, that figure right now is closer to 25%. Now, I want to point out, down here in the corner where you see, trust me, you in back can't see it, but trust me, what I'm circling right here is OMB and CBO. And that's pretty significant, because OMB, the method we use in Washington, D.C. to estimate spending and taxes is a process called scoring. And so OMB and CBO scored these graphs. OMB is within the executive branch. That's the Office of Management and Budget. CBO is a Congressional Budget Office. Obviously, it's in the Congress. And both of them, while they don't agree precisely on all numbers, they agree that this is accurate unless we get a handle here on this debt. Now, clearly, this starts crossing GDP here in about, now again, I'm using figures from 2010, but you can see about 20, 21, 22, something like that, we start going over if we do nothing. What I'm all saying here is nothing is done. Now, the question is, how long can we go here before we totally collapse? And when you look at what's going on in Europe, and particularly Greece and Spain and some of those countries, that could be potentially the forerunner where we are unless we get a handle on this. Now, the challenge of getting a handle on this is when you look at the unified overall budget, because you're dealing with people issues. Put up the second slide, Tim. This is what we call the unified budget. Well, not a very good pointer here. This area right here on the left side, your left side, comprises about 60% of the total budget. That is what we call mandatory spending or entitlement spending. And as you can see, it's made up, the red part there is Social Security, the one purple is Medicare, and the one right above that is Medicaid. Those three comprise nearly 50%, as you can see, of the total budget. Now, if we're ever going to get a reform in place, we're going to have to deal with these issues. Those are political challenges because every one of those issues deal with people. And so, but if we don't deal with that, then we are simply going to not have, the freedoms that we have. On the other side, you have the green pie here, and that is what we call non-defense discretionary spending, and this is defense spending. Both of those are discretionary, meaning that they're subject to appropriations every year. That comprises about 40% of the budget, as you can see. So in other words, if you wipe out all of government, just take it away and don't fund anything in government, this is what you would save here in this pie chart. If you completely cut out defense, have no army or anything, that's what you would cut out. You'd still have 60% of the budget that needs to be dealt with. So that's the challenge. Now, there have to be some reforms, and frankly, I've been talking about reforms of some of those programs going way back to 1998 when Medicare was first got to a point where they only had about 5 years of solvency, and since then there have been some reforms to it. But here is the first principle, especially when you deal with Social Security and Medicare, because those are people programs. The first principle is in ideas that have been floated in Washington, D.C. as to resolve those problems. The first principle is anybody that is in the system is not affected. Nobody in the system is affected. All potential changes are prospective in nature. And the general time period of that prospective change is 10 years. In other words, if you're 55 and retire at 65, then there'd be some potential changes. But nobody in the system would have to have a change. My mother passed away last year at 95, and I could see myself walking in saying, Mom, there's been some big changes here in Medicare and the Social Security. It just wouldn't fly. So keep in mind that principle. Now, there is a solution to that, and that solution has been on the board for the last 2 years. The means of that solution is embodied in legislation that both the House and the Senate are to develop and pass. Keep in mind, we have two bodies. We have the House and the Senate. Before anything can become law, both houses have to vote on that, and of course it has to go to the President. So the most important document that both houses should be dealing with is the budget document. Now, the budget on the federal level is different than what you would associate with your city governments or county governments, because the budget on the federal level, what we call a budget, does not spend any money. It is simply a blueprint for spending. It allocates X number of dollars to go to various areas, and then the various appropriation committees will appropriate the dollars. But the budget is an important document because it is the blueprint. And so the last 2 years there has been a document out. It deals with spending, it deals with taxes on a broad scale. In other words, it'll say, this is the plan ahead, and such a committee shall carry it out to meet these goals. And both houses are supposed to vote on that, and both houses are supposed to pass them, and that's what the process is. So let me put up the next one, Tim. This is the budget that has been in place that the House Republicans, I'm being parochial, I'm a member of the House, I happen to be a Republican, so therefore that's Republican budget. As you can see here in the green, it takes where we are and makes reforms, and I'll talk about them briefly, and it drastically changes the curve. Drastically changes the curve, but it really doesn't do so for another 5 to 10 years just based on scoring. Now, I want to point out once again, down here in the corner, you see OMB and CBO. That means the Office of Management and Budget, that means the Congressional Budget Office have both scored our budgets, and they have come to the same conclusion as to bending the curve, if you will. Now, it obviously doesn't do any good to talk about these programs and challenges unless there are potential solutions to them. And as I mentioned, the budget document is a document that deals with taxes and spending. Within this budget document, the last 2 years, I voted for it the last 2 years, it did a couple of real major changes. It directed the respective committees to come up with solutions to Medicare and Medicaid. It was silent on the issue of Social Security, and the reason for that is Social Security has more solvency than these other two programs, and you have to deal with these first two programs. But it also deals with the tax policy. We live in a country that has a free economy, and the way any government, whether you're talking about the local level or the federal level, the only way that they can get funds is, of course, is to have a robust economy when you tax people for enterprise. And one of the things that I've discovered in talking to people throughout my district in the last, actually the last several years, since the downturn of 2008, is that there are a lot of small businesses, because we were not hurt as badly here as other parts of the country. There are small businesses that have done fairly well. But the one thing that I've heard over and over is the uncertainty of the tax code as to making their decisions whether they're going to make investments or not. In fact, some small businesses have admitted to me that they have cash, but they're afraid to spend it. So the budget here, the Republican budget that was put forth, does a couple of things to the tax code. It has 2 tax brackets, and it lowers the tax code. It broadens it and gets rid of loopholes, plus it makes it permanent. Right now, we are living in an era, unfortunately, of temporary tax code. And when you have a policy in the country of a temporary tax policy and a permanent spending policy, something, to me, is amiss. So the budget then deals with spending from the standpoint of reforms to Medicare and Medicaid. And let me just briefly say what they are. These are not all-inclusive by any stretch of the imagination. But with Medicare, once again, the first principle, anybody that's in the system, you don't change the system. But what you do is you bring choices into the system for people that are on Medicare. And there is a model, by the way, that has worked. It's been in place for nearly 10 years. It's called Medicare Part D, which is a prescription drug portion of Medicare Part D. And that is a program, by the way, that when it was put in place, it was estimated to cost X dollars in 5 or 6 years. It actually came in 40% under budget. And why? The reason why is because seniors had choices. I mentioned my mother passed away at 95, but I've never understood the notion because of government policies that once you turn 65, you're incapable of making decisions. And yet that is principally is what happens. So the choices, one of the proposals that is out and being talked about is to give seniors the same choices as they do on Medicare Part D with all of their premiums. They can decide how much coverage they want, and that would be part of it would be subsidized by the federal government. So if you have a federal program that came in 40% under budget like Medicare Part D, why would you not try to emulate in a broader way? And that's one of the suggestions that's being thrown out. The other one on the pie chart there, Tim, is go back to that pie chart, is Medicaid. Medicaid is health care for the poor, and the principle there is the principle that we used in welfare reform in 1995, when we passed welfare reform and essentially drove a lot of the decision making back to the states, because you have more efficiency in the states when you're closer to wherever the problem is. I think the same thing can be done with Medicaid, and again, when you look at that and you score that, in fact, you do save money. So those are just 2 broad, very, very broad suggestions on changes that can be made in entitlement spending. But probably the most important part of that budget, once again, is flattening the tax code and making it permanent, so that businesses and entrepreneurs and those that create jobs can have some certainty when they make an investment. Right now, there's no certainty at all. But here's the problem. The problem is, and I'll sound very parochial, and go back to that other slide, that one there. I mentioned that both the House and the Senate have to pass a budget. We have passed a budget for 2 years that reflects what I pointed out here. The Senate has not passed a budget in 3 years. Now, it is very, very hard to negotiate with somebody when they don't have something on the table. I fully recognize the makeup of the Senate is different than the House. They have different ideas. That was the genius of the Founding Fathers, was to make that conflict. So you really have to work together and compromise in order to get something done. But both sides have to be willing to come to the table. And we have come to the table with this proposal. But the Senate for 3 years hasn't got it. It's kind of like buying a house and saying, okay, I'll give you X amount of dollars for your house, and the person says no, but you don't know if you're high, low, or indifferent. How do you negotiate on something like that? And so that's where the problem is, and that's where the challenge is. But I wanted to say that, and go back again, Tim, to the first slide. This is the challenge that's ahead of us unless we act, and we need to act sooner rather than later. That is where we are. It's been scored. Second slide again, Tim. This is the challenge. You are dealing with a part of the overall federal spending, of which 60% is mandatory or entitlement spending. And then the last chart, there is a solution to it. And it obviously has to go through the political machinations that we have in our country. So that's where we are. I hope that I hope that we have a more earnest discussion on this. I've been talking about these charts actually for the past 18 months in various places I've spoken around the district, because I think it's that important, but we have to have an adult discussion on it in order to get solutions that we can do for the next generation. And I'll just conclude the remarks here, because I see there's some younger people here in the crowd. You don't have to yell out your answer, but if anybody here is, say, 40 or younger, do you really believe that Social Security and Medicare will be there for you unless there are some changes made? I know I talk to people that age group, and well, I can say that personally because my kids are in that age group, and so we need to make that change for the next generation. So that's the big picture on the federal level, and that's the challenges that we face. We also have some other issues that we hopefully will deal with before the end of the year, at least start doing that. And that's the issue of sequestration, which are across-the-board cuts that will take effect in January unless we make some changes on that. Now, if you haven't noticed, this is an election year. And and so, to be in all honesty, none of these will probably be resolved very seriously until Americans go to the polls in November, and we'll see where we are from a political standpoint. That's when they'll be addressed. Now, let me talk about a couple of local issues. As John mentioned, I'm the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee, and we had a hearing here in Pasco last week that was well attended on hydropower. Now, just to go back a bit, hydropower is our principal source of energy here in the Northwest. We get 70% of our electricity from hydropower here in Washington State alone. I think Idaho is a little bit higher than that, and Oregon's a little bit less than that. But we are very unique. No place in the country relies on hydropower like we do. And one would think that especially when all this discussion about environmental issues and pollution and so on, one would think that hydropower, which is a clean source of energy, is something that ought to be promoted. But as you well know, there have been ongoing efforts to take out the dams on the lower Snake River. Those efforts, we thought those efforts would probably go away about 10 years ago. I can tell you every year in Congress there is a bill that is introduced that will either overtly say remove the dams on the Snake River or have a study to do that. The issue simply won't go away. So my response to that as chairman of the committee was to draft a bill that in a sense goes on offense in that regard. And there's two principal parts to it. Actually, there's more principal parts, but let me just talk about two. The first is on federal dams. As big as these facilities are, they should not be removed at all unless Congress says they should be removed. And the reason for that is what we have gone through with the management plan of the Columbia River, called the BIOP, that has been agreed to by most of the stakeholders for the last 7 years, but has been tied up in court by a federal judge in Portland. And he kept saying, go back to the table, indicating that dam breaching should be on the table. Now, he never said that overtly when he was not retired, but after he retired, he was on public radio in Idaho, and he said that he thought the dams on the Snake River should be breached. Well, I don't think any unelected official should have the ability to make that decision that would have such a profound effect on us. Because keep in mind, we would not have the economy we have right here were it not for the dams. You can start with Grand Coulee Dam that irrigates the 500,000 plus acres of the Columbia Basin Project, and let's look how much wealth that has created. Plus all the low-cost power that we all enjoy. So that was one of the principal parts of this bill. Another was we have found, and I have found in other areas as chairman of this committee, that there are a lot of groups that get federal funding and then they turn around and sue the federal government. Now, I think there's something wrong with that principle, because any time the government is sued by anybody, the taxpayers have to pick up the tab in order to defend whatever the lawsuit is. why should we subsidize the plaintiffs to sue at the same time? So anybody that is involved in that sort of activity, I don't think should be able to sue. Thank you. So that was we had that hearing. Like I said last, it was well attended. We thought the testimony was very, very good. The bill was introduced just before we broke for the August recess. I honestly don't expect any action on the bill between now and the end of Congress, but it's going to be the subject of debate in the next Congress. I can tell you that, and I think we need to be on the offense in that regards. Two other issues dealing with Hanford, not necessarily the funding part there. Although I will say this: in the time that I have had the privilege to represent this district, and I reflect back on what was going on at Hanford when I was first elected compared to now, there's been a huge change. Now, does that mean that everything goes absolutely perfectly? Of course not. We're dealing with the most contaminated area of hazardous nuclear waste really in the world. This is a huge project. And I think the work that's being done out there and the progress in the time that I've represented this area has been really pretty remarkable. But there are some challenges that need to be addressed. And I have had and continue to have a good working relationship on a bipartisan way. John mentioned I was the founder of the Nuclear Cleanup Caucus, and we are active every year in that regard. But there's two other things that I think are very important. As cleanup winds down, and by definition, when you have an end of cleanup, you need to have something hopefully that'll take its place. Tridic is trying to get, rightfully so, some of the land there so they can expand economically out there. I fully support that. But there's two other areas that may seem small, but I think are pretty significant. And one of them is Rattlesnake Mountain, and the other is the B reactor. Now, I just want to ask here, how many people have had the opportunity to be on top of Rattlesnake? Yeah, but quite a few, but look how many people have not. How many people have been to, say, the top of, well, you can pick any other peak around, I suppose. Maybe Mount Adams. How many people have gone to Mount Adams? Well, that's all right. That didn't quite work. I should have tested that out beforehand. But my point is that Rattlesnake was closed off when we were in the weapons development business, which rightfully so. Why would you want to give potentially to somebody that is your enemy a bird's eye view of what's going on? So rightfully so, Rattlesnake was closed off to anybody going up on top of Rattlesnake. But we're not in the defense production anymore. We're in the cleanup part of it. And with our growing tourism here that we have in this area and the emerging wine industry and people coming into this area from a tourist standpoint, any way to make our economy grow, why shouldn't we have access to the top of Rattlesnake Mountain? And so the bill that I have introduced now has passed the House. It's pending in the Senate, and hopefully we can get it. Hopefully we can get that passed. And the other part is really, I think, really significant, because we're not for the Second World War. Where we live here in the Tri-Cities, it would be very different. We're a largely agriculture area anyway, but one can imagine if it were not for the Second World War, we would probably be even more robustly agriculture oriented. But because of the Second World War, and because at that time the thought was that Nazi Germany was ahead of us in the making of atomic weapons, the Manhattan Project was started, and Hanford here was picked as one of those sites to be part of the Manhattan Project. And there are three principal reasons why that was done. The first, it was pretty remote. Richland only had 500 people at that time, and Pasco and Kennewick probably were 1,500, about at that. So there wasn't many people that lived here, number one, and not necessarily in any order. Number two, of course, Hanford is bordered by the Columbia River, huge source of water that was needed for nuclear energy. And the third reason was the proximity to Grand Coulee Dam, so you had power. So as a result, people that were living in Hanford literally were given 30 days to get off their lands, and a lot of them didn't even have a chance to harvest their crops. That's how serious it was. But the effort out there, we should always remind ourselves, we ended the Second World War because of the efforts out here. And number two, the efforts out here, I think, largely contributed to the demise of the Soviet Union, which ended the Cold War, because of the efforts out here. But when you build something like that, you create a lot of waste. And that has to be cleaned up, because if you get radioactivity, for example, into the Columbia River, one can only imagine what it would do downstream into our economy. So this is something that needs to be cleaned up. But nevertheless, the focal point of that historic part was the B reactor. Now, how many people here have had an opportunity to go to the B reactor? Oh yeah, okay, well you get what I'm getting to there. Well, we passed legislation out of my committee making that part of the national parks, along with Los Alamos and Oak Ridge, and I hope that we can get that passed before the end of this Congress, and within 1 year, Hanford B reactor will be part of the national park system. I might say, just kind of interestingly, I guess, the B reactor, you know, was built in 11 months. I doubt if you can do the paperwork for a nuclear reactor right now in 11 months. But nevertheless, in the committee hearing on this bill, and I give the Department of Interior and Department of Energy a lot of credit, and particularly the site managers out here for helping in this endeavor to get them to come together. But in testimony, both Interior and Energy testified, and they were fully in support of what we're trying to do. And so I asked a question. I said, now you have 1 year to get an agreement. Do you suppose you can do that? And they said, oh yes. And I said, I certainly hope so. Like I say, it only took 11 months to build the thing. We can certainly get the agreement, I would hope. So at any rate, those are some of the local things that are going, but I think long term it'll continue to have a positive impact for the area here where we live. So with that, let me just conclude my general remarks, and Lori, open it up to questions, and when you stand up or somebody else, I'll know it's time to quit. So, yes.
Don't want to yell at you, Congressman, but I think living in this wonderful community, we live in a bit of a bubble, and I'm profoundly grateful that you represent us with stability and courage and knowledge. And I think we should all believe you in doing that.
Good. Well, thank you. Well, the question is what's the appetite of my colleagues in both houses to handle the reforms that I was talking about up here? I think honestly, it gets better and better all of the time, but we should do it sooner rather than later. Just a couple of, I mentioned, Medicare in its current form, if there's no changes, by the latest report that I've seen, will be dead broke in 11 years. Now, the longer you wait, probably the closer that comes. And then what happens? What happens if Medicare goes dead broke and we don't change anything? Well, then we're going to get to a system where if you can't pay the providers, the healthcare providers for that healthcare, they've got to make a living like everybody else. They're going to deny people access to healthcare. That's called rationing. So we need to deal with it sooner rather than later. As I mentioned, Social Security is a little bit farther out. But here's the good news, and this is why I think it's good news. If I am correct in my assessment that people under 40, as I mentioned earlier, don't believe that they're going to be collecting health, Medicare and Social Security, the good news is that they're 40. Why do I say that? Because generally when you get up to that age, you start getting involved politically. You've established yourself in one way or the other, and that is the way. So the demographics are in our favor. That age group should demand of their elected leaders get this thing done sooner rather than later. So in answer to your question, as that demographic from a voting standpoint expands, this election and subsequent elections, I think the appetite gets better and better because the alternative is to have those programs go dead broke. And I don't think anybody wants that. But I think it gets better, but we have to have an honest discussion of this. You simply can't ignore that figure that is scored by both the executive branch and the congressional branch. You can't ignore that. And then when we see what's happening in Europe, action needs to be taken sooner rather than later. I hope that appetite is there. I can tell you in the House, when we pass that budget, generally the budget document is the hardest one to pass because it deals with everything and everybody has a little part of it. It was a slam dunk the last 2 years because it dealt with these issues. Further questions? Yes. Well, the question is, and the question was couched during the Clinton administration, Social Security had a surplus. As a matter of fact, it goes back before that. I don't know that Clinton was any part of that or not. The last reform of Social Security was in the early 80s. But I will say this: the law says that if Social Security runs surpluses, and they are running a surplus now, more money is coming into Social Security than is being paid out right now. That time period is shortening, I might add. But by law, any surplus has to be used to buy government bonds. So it is reinvested back in, and it's part of the debt that we're going to have to pay off. It's part of that debt, but it's not publicly held debt, it's government held debt. And so there's a distinction. But by law, if there is a surplus in Social Security, it's not a trust fund, it's a pay-as-you-go. Those of you who are paying in are paying those that are receiving it right now. And it is running a surplus, and that surplus is used to buy bonds, and of course that's fund the government, and of course you have to pay that back. So that adds to that red line. But there was nothing that was associated that I can think of with the Clinton years. This is a process that's been going on for some time. That's the way the system was when it was last reformed. And I wasn't in Congress that time in the mid '80s. That was part of. I don't know if that was part of the change, but nevertheless, that's what the law says today. Further questions? Yes. Well, I hope. No. Well, no. Listen. You make the point. Yeah, you're paying 15% of your income into Social Security. I mean, that's when you put your employer match, and your employer obviously matches that. That's part of the salary, so it's 15% in real terms. But Social Security, listen. We just need to understand the history. When Social Security, couple of tidbits. When Social Security was enacted in 1935, the age of receiving it was 65 years old. The life expectancy in 1935 was 62. So they were betting that this was probably a pretty good deal. Now, the number of people paying in to the recipients, the ratio was roughly 40 to 1 then. 40 people paying in to that many people collecting it. Today the ratio is less than 3 to 1 because of the great expansion during the 1950s. And so right now we are paying the consequences of those decisions in the past. That's why we need to address it. Now I will tell you what I think part, not all, but part of the reforms in Social Security. Again, the first principle, nobody in the system currently is changed. And then whatever changes should be voluntary in nature. Voluntary in nature, nothing mandatory. But I believe that everybody, if they want, should have an opportunity to take part of their Social Security tax and put it in a private account, personal account for themselves. And the reason I say that, once again, we have a history of this, how that has worked in this country. In the early 1980s, again, I wasn't in Congress, there was a bill that was introduced to establish individual retirement accounts, or IRAs. Now, at that time, I'm told, the debate against that was, oh, you can't trust people to put money in, put in retirement. You can't trust people to make investments on their own behalf. Because at that time, less than 50%, way less than 50% of the American people were invested. Now, well over half of the Americans are invested in one way or the other. Why shouldn't we trust them? Why are they incapable of making decisions when they turn 65? Now, that's just one solution. And there's other things that we obviously need to do. But you are exactly right. You're in that demographic group that is paying that 15%. And I won't ask you how old that is. It'd be very rude of me to ask you how old. But if you are not within about 25 years of retirement, you're in tough shape if we don't change Social Security. I'll say that right now. Any high school, any college graduate today, Any college graduate, even before they go in the workforce, right today, there will be no Social Security when they retire. That's as simple a fact. It needs to be changed sooner rather than later. Way back.
I was reading an article last night in Newsweek magazine, and the author said that in the last 2 years alone, 3.6 million people have been moved to the Social Security disability. Is that true?
I don't know the answer to that, but I've heard the same statistics. And I don't know the answer to that. In fact, I just heard this actually when we, just before or right when we were breaking for the August recess. But this is probably part of what we need to do in the Congress. What we need to do is to have more oversight of that mandatory part. We don't do enough oversight. And that should have been discovered, frankly, by part of the responsibility, in my view, of Congress looking at these programs. Why is this happening? I mean, why, if that in fact is true? I don't know the answer to that, but I have to assume until, you know, that maybe there's a semblance of truth. Whether it's that high, I don't know the answer to that. But that is a very, very good question. But I see John standing up here. It's not Lori. It's all right, either way, I can figure this out. Listen, thank you all for having me. I very much appreciate your attendance. Thank you.